Hello, I'm wondering whether we should start now. We have a number of participants filling up. We will start now, and people will join us as we go along. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, because I believe our audience is from all over the world. And we will start now. I'm Kumi Samuel, an executive committee member of DAWN and a co-editor of the book, Political Economy of Conflict and Violence Against Women, which we are launching today. This book builds on previous work by DAWN and moves to explore the complex and multi-layered internal and global political economic dimensions that underpin conflict and war. A few years ago, we at DAWN, with our history of political economy and intersectional analysis, sought to develop a feminist political economy, a framing from the global south. We wish to understand violence against women in conflict and war, expanding and developing on the work of Yati Nurtu when she was the special rapporteur on violence against women and its causes and consequences. This big book brings together the research and insights of feminists working in or on contexts of war and conflict. They write on Colombia, Sudan, South Sudan, Northern Uganda, Northeast India, and Sri Lanka from various points of view. The authors call for situating violence against women within historical and contemporary political and economic structures and relationships at the national, the subnational, the regional, and the global level. The chapter on Colombia, authored by Cecilia, Lopez, Montano, and Maria Holstein, provides a richly textured understanding of the political economy of Colombia's long-standing and complex war, its class dimensions, and the marked differences among its three armed agonists. On rural women's important yet unrecognized role as crucial actors in the war. The study on Papua New Guinea by Elizabeth Cox discusses the role of foreign-owned and environmentally devastating extractive industries in exacerbating gender and intra-community inequalities. These in turn facilitated the build-up of arms and conflict, resulting in terrifying and violent implications for women in PNG. The chapter on Sri Lanka, written by Vagisha Gunasekar and the late Vijay Nagaraj, who helped us generously to develop our initial framing for this book, demonstrates that the icon of the self-employed woman from areas affected by conflict is part of the global drive towards financialization. The chapter uniquely traces the violence inherent in the gendered processes of responsibilization that in turn reinforce particular gendered ideologies and structural violence. The case from the northeast of India, researched by Roshmi Goswami, highlights repression, militarization, othering, and cultural violence as modes of control and gendered violence in key subnational conflicts in the region and their protracted peace processes. The Sudan, South Sudan by Fahima Hashim discusses the complexity imposed by multiple and overlapping religious and customary structures of social control and the violence inherent in those. The chapter on Northern Uganda, written by Alibe Clark and Constance O'Brien, discusses women's community peace initiatives and examines the gendered socioeconomic and political shifts that occurred as a result of war. It also interrogates ways in which women's agency attempted to subvert patriarchal norms. A number of themes emerged from the research and include militarization and gendered violence in the context of authoritarian rule, states of exception, and patriarchal power and control. A recurrent theme relates to how war and conflict shape and reinforce historical and entrenched forms of sexuality. A third deals with the gendered economies of war as the authors move away from the overdetermined focus on sexualized, ethnicized, and militarized violence against women, which is the predominant narrative of violence experienced by women in conflict and war, as we know. This book seeks to do something different with that framing. The authors draw attention critically to neoliberal globalization, which has transformed processes of accumulation by dispossession, leading to multiple forms of gendered structural violence in times of war, as they do in so-called peacetime. The other dominant theme relates to the changes in the sexual division of labor within the family and the household, and the challenge this poses to the notion of male as provider and the inherent violence that follows from that change. Several of the studies in the book also discuss peace-building processes while critiquing the neoliberal imperatives of peacemaking and peace-building. This book also places special emphasis on the centrality of violence in social organization and its role in producing and reproducing the gender order, and conversely, how the gender order in turn justifies and reproduces unequal and violent power relations in society, which are firmly anchored, of course, in overlapping patriarchies. Critically, therefore, the authors argue that the significance of structural violence, with its hallmarks of long-term oppression, discrimination, and impoverishment in the lives of women, cannot be ignored, should not be ignored. Nor can the reality that the end of conflict and war rarely marks an end to these complex forms of violence against women. And certainly that war is never merely a simplistic and temporal deviation from the normal. In many ways, this book is an attempt to challenge ourselves as Southern feminists to employ different ways of thinking and analysis about the gendered violence of war and conflict. I believe, and I'm convinced, the presentations to follow will be insightful, challenging, and provocative for us to listen to today, but to use in future work. And now, I'm extremely pleased to introduce Dr. Radhika Kumaraswamy. She was the first UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and its causes and consequences, as you know, and the former Undersecretary and Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Arms Conflict. She was also the lead author of the Global Study on Women, Peace and Security, a very, very important piece of writing and analysis, and a member of the fact-finding mission to Myanmar. In Sri Lanka, she was director of the International Center for Ethnic Studies, chairman of the Human Rights Commission, the National Human Rights Commission, and a member of the Constitutional Council. She is also a member of the global faculty of the New York University School of Law. It is really a privilege to have you here today, Radhika, with us to present the review of the book. This is particularly so because you were one of the first special rapporteurs who grappled with gender and feminist framings of violence against women. May I now invite you to present your review of the book. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Dawn and especially Kumudini Samuel for inviting me to speak here today. These gatherings are very much a part of the solidarity networks that keep women strong and engaged. It is important that we keep these frank and constructive dialogues going so that the gains of the last few decades will be nuanced and consolidated. For the last few years, I have been slightly uncomfortable with the narratives coming out of New York on the women, peace, and security agenda. And reading this book and preparing this intervention has allowed me the opportunity to clarify my thoughts on one of the most dynamic issues of our times. There's a strong, clear, and concerted narrative coming out of the Security Council deliberations on women, peace, and security. The initial resolution spelled out 4 areas: prevention, protection, participation, and post-conflict reconstruction. Of these, the Council has concentrated on 3 areas: sexual violence and conflict, women's representation in institutions and processes that manage conflict, and also violent extremism and its impact on women. All serious writing in the field of women, peace, and security that relate to the Security Council begin with sexual violence during conflict. With a dedicated special representative, the Security Council was initially criticized for making it the only issue of the Council. Having interviewed and visited survivors of many wars, including in Bosnia and Rwanda, I do not want to underestimate the importance of creating an international bottom line with regard to sexual violence. The important work led by feminists such as Catherine McKinnon must be appreciated, and its importance continues to be relevant. They are landmark interventions that shifted the terrain on how we think about and deal with violence against women. In recent times, the main thrust of those working on the women, peace, and security agenda before the Council has shifted toward women's representation in all aspects of the peace process and the military institutions that play a role in ending and managing conflict. This too remains an important goal. An enormous amount of energy and advocacy has taken place to make sure women are at the table, that their issues make the agenda, and that parallel events keep main negotiators accountable. This too has seen some very important results. The Security Council has also engaged in the more controversial task of exploring linkages between violent extremism, hostility, and violence against women, often chronicling the terrorist acts that take an unimaginable toll on women and girls. The other lived reality of the enormous burden that counterterrorism strategies place on communities as a whole, and women in particular, is rarely documented or spoken about before the Council. These narratives coming out of the Security Council have inspired many to act and make real changes, but they have also spawned a whole host of literature, primarily from the Global South, that is in conversation with this particular framing of issues relating to women in conflict. Dawn's publication, The Political Economy of Conflict and Violence Against Women, is one such volume. It is a pioneering effort to complicate, nuance, and sometimes confront the global discourse. With regard to the specific narrative coming out of the Security Council, the Dawn publication questions whether sexual violence that occurs during wartime is that exceptional, and whether a better framing would be to understand it as part of a continuum, pre-conflict, during conflict, and post-conflict. The roots and patterns will often be the same. The traditional forms of violence and discrimination may just manifest themselves in morbid forms during war. The publication also casts a critical eye on the advocacy around women's representation and the extraordinary effort made in what the authors call, quote, seeking women's decision-making in structures of the existing frames of war, unquote. We are passionate to get women involved in decision-making, but it is often to shore up institutions that have made their singular contribution to tension and war. For this, the many efforts to include women in military forces in the Global South do raise some uneasy questions. Finally, there is a great deal of criticism of framing violent extremism as a one-way threat within the counter-terrorist framework. The reality in many of the countries of the South include women embedded in communities that have felt the backlash and ruthlessness of counterinsurgency tactics and practices. Women with their ambivalent positions as members of the community and the buffer against extreme brutality are often in a dangerous situation, being the peace builders that both sides have to trust. In addition to the specific questions relating to the existing global discourse on women, peace, and security, the volume, and especially the case studies, delve deeper. Yaliwe Clark, as in her Ugandan case study, points out war destabilizes men's heteronormative dominance over social and material stability. It is therefore an interregnum that creates morbid symptoms. At the same time, it provides opportunities for women to transform themselves and their societies. To truly understand what is going on in the real world of women in peace and security, one must delve into the local. The wonderful case studies in this book do precisely that. They give us situated knowledge that allows us to challenge some of our assumptions about the directions and priorities of a globally driven movement on women, peace, and security. They recall the work of people like Kimberly Crenshaw to focus our minds on intersectionality, where category of woman intersects with region, class, race, religion, and other categories. The need to draw out the diverse realities of women in the local context is paramount. It gives us a fuller sense of what is real. Dawn's publication is one such starting point. The volume also reminds us that despite one of the most comprehensive frameworks for crimes of sexual violence at the International Criminal Court and other similar courts, very few women actually come forward to make their complaints. The emblematic cases are few and far between. There is need to find alternative forms. Roshmi Goswami in the Indian chapter brings forth the idea and concept of transformative justice for issues facing the community in Northeast India. Confronting crimes beyond the law and at the community level may be the only option where formal systems of justice are non-existent, incapable, or do not inspire security and confidence in the victim. The volume also questions the framework, especially in the mass media, of women as always being victims of conflict. As the volume points out, women are often participants, actors, leading and negotiating within a militarized political system. The Ugandan case study shows us that war can be an opportunity for women's agency and subversion of patriarchy. Focusing on women fighters who were once in positions of sexual slavery, to IDPs, to women involved in micro-level groups, the Ugandan case study gives us a sense of women's initiatives that have had a lasting effect on their communities. Women are increasingly owning their reality, refusing to be spoken for. Unique and creative strategies are used and implemented. For example, in Uganda, strategies to help communities reimagine masculinity away from war by valorizing men who perform peaceful masculinities is particularly interesting. In this debate on women's agency and wartime, Cecilia Lopez in the Colombian case study gives us a very nuanced and complicated picture of the female combatant, her often willing recruitment, reaching insurmountable frontiers, and yet having to compromise when it came to cruel strictures, some relating to reproductive health. The ambivalent agency of women combatants in armed groups is rarely captured in the official narratives of the Security Council, and it is a great silence. As the Colombian case study shows us, this often results in their being denied rights and benefits of war after the war. Their partial empowerment makes them restless in peacetime, when society makes no effort to provide for an easy transition into civilian life. The main contribution of this volume is not only to raise questions on the women, peace, and security agenda, but to also posit women and conflict within a political economy frame. This they do while in conversation with the dominant narrative. A political economy frame would mean focusing on structures, not individuals, and ideologies, not case studies. It would mean analyzing causes and consequences of violence against women. While doing so, the book also attempts to unsettle categories that have often been the assumptions for discussion, attempting to move forward toward newer ways of understanding the issues. The first structures the volume looks through, many of its case studies, are the structures of the military and militarization. For a long time, as the Indian chapter points out, the militarized canvas is often associated with sexual violence and impunity. This looms large, and many wars from Bosnia to Myanmar make impunity the central discourse when it comes to the military. But the military in many countries of the global south is so much more. In some countries, the military is involved in businesses and administration with independent income, independent decision-making, and armed with new technologies of surveillance and harassment. Theirs is not an inclusive space or a participatory one. They rule by diktat, completely blurring the lines between the military and the civilian, and in some places challenging and provoking democracy. Myanmar is the poster nation for this kind of military structure. However, democratic and people's forces do resist, and in some powerful ways. This resistance is captured in some of the chapters of this volume. The second type of structure that is highlighted in this book relates to economic frameworks. Neoliberal strategies place emphasis on state-sponsored programs to create women entrepreneurs. In post-conflict situations, this often means livelihood support in low-level skills from sewing to beauty sculpture. One aspect related to this that has taken a life of its own in post-conflict situations is the financialization of these areas through microcredit and microfinance initiatives. The Sri Lankan case study is truly revealing, with Kumudini Samuel and Lagisha Gunasekara showing us how these initiatives that focus on women's entrepreneurship and highlight self-reliance often result in crippling debt and suicide. Post-war reconstruction is too often only infrastructure development and livelihood initiatives. Substantial development in agriculture, commerce, and technology, which is people-driven, is rarely invested in. The Sri Lankan case study highlights the contingency of women's existence in a precarious post-war setting. The strength of this volume is also the nexus it reveals between big business and conflict realities, a nexus that often frames the nature of existence for women. Geopolitical economic competition, the imperative of capital, all affect women in profound ways in their day-to-day life in post-conflict societies. This aspect of war is never covered in mainstream women, peace, and security frameworks. As Elizabeth Cox in the case study on Papua New Guinea clearly indicates, she clearly shows how extractive industries are central to the understanding of war and conflict in the region. The power and influence of these industries make them central players. The Colombian case study highlights agribusiness and the dispossession of large populations and how this dispossession goes into the making of guerrillas and paramilitaries. Colombia also highlights the terrible impact of drug dealership and the drug industry, its entanglement with powerful elites, and the rapid decline of moral and ethical values. The author also points to the link between plastic cosmetic surgery, beauty culture, and the drug industry. Post-war, women also seek employment in factories and free trade zones, and this too has implications for their quality of life and their ability to care for their families. Exploitation of female labor in factories, domestic work, and certain trafficking contexts is accentuated in the post-conflict situation, making women vulnerable as they try to leave and migrate to a better place. Traffickers, as they say, fish in the sea of migration. Every conflict has an exodus. This too is part of the political economy of conflict. Economic policies and powerful economic actors, both local and international, often overdetermine all other aspects of life in post-conflict reality. The influence of powerful economic actors prevent proper regulation of such matters as labor or the environment, and post-conflict scenarios are then that of land grabbing, dispossession, and unregulated enterprise. Exposing these links is one of the important aspects of this volume. The need for the women, peace, security agenda to engage with these issues like these is extremely important if it is to remain relevant. To move away from addressing these profound contradictions would be to suspend the WPS agenda in an unreal world where the grinding reality of the life that many women actually lead is never revealed. Finally, a political economy approach must also deal with ideology. What this volume also suggests is that despite all the developments, upheavals, and choices that war brings, sometimes things do not change. There is often no permanent transformation in the realm of ideas or social practice. While war disturbs the social fabric, peace brings back old religious and customary structures of control. Fahima Hashim in the South Sudan case study describes this well and in detail. The slow emergence of traditional sets of control over women is often the future we have to look forward to. Even developments in northern Sri Lanka point to a return to oppressive pre-war structures that kept women in a different kind of victimhood. This reemergence may just be an indication that the old never went away. To change post-conflict societies, we have to look beyond individuals and individual acts of violence. Hence the constant refrain of the authors that we must take to heart. There should not be an imaginary line separating pre-war, during war, and post-war. women's discrimination and subjugation must always be seen on a continuum. Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security have prioritized individual acts of violence that have shocked the conscience and individual representation of women in peace processes and institutions. Recent resolutions, though, show a promise of moving further. A political economic approach, on the other hand, is about power. How political, economic, and social structures and actors determine the everyday life of women and the limited choices they are actually allowed to make. To ignore how power is expressed and enjoyed, and to not locate women within those realities would be to ignore the actual lived reality of women. A political economic approach must supplement the moral outrage of the extremes. Such an approach is refreshing and welcome. We must thank all the contributors to this volume for opening our eyes. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Radhika. This was really a very comprehensive review of, and in particular, because you contextualized it with your experience, UN processes of the Security Council, and particularly its agenda on women, peace, and security, and today its extension into work on counterterrorism, so-called, and violent extremism. And you're situating the political economy of conflict for us within this narrative. So thank you very, very much for the analysis. I will move now to introduce Bhagisha Gunasekara, who will be framing the book for us. And let me see. Yes, Bhagisha was the co-editor, was one of the co-editors of the book with myself and Cass Slatter of Dawn. And she also authored the Sri Lanka chapter with Vijay Nagraj. Bhagisha is a Sri Lankan political economist, and she's a senior lecturer in the Department of Studies of the Open University. She's affiliated with the Social Sciences. She received the university in the US. Bhagisha takes the political economy of emerging contexts and practices of governance and labor. Played a role in framing give us a framing, an understanding of the framing of the study, and she will move on to speak of the Sri Lanka case study as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Kumi. I hope everybody can see my screen that I have shared with all. I have a few slides to sort of drive home the key points that we are talking about when we talk about this framing of this book, framing of gendered violence, that is. So to answer Kumi's question, our attempt to frame gendered violence comes from observations and discourses and praxis of various intellectual and advocacy agendas that Dr. Kumaraswamy talked about, and also as authors that we are involved in, both nationally and globally. We work in different political, economic, social, cultural contexts, and some of us write about political economies of violence against women in our countries as much or more from experiential insights as from scholarly research. We read, think, and articulate feminism in varied registers. And we felt that it was important to record, document these registers as well, because there is a homogenization of these registers in which we talk about violence, gendered violence also. I think Donna Haraway called this situated knowledges. So our very diverse situated knowledges led us to interrogate the preoccupation with direct violence in gender analyses of conflict or war-affected settings, which often tend to portray conflict, violence, and its gendered experience in extremely narrow ways. For instance, those of us who are involved in peace building, peacemaking, transitional justice work know that what gets highlighted is victims of rape and sexual crimes, either in times of war or in times of peace, as Dr. Kumaraswamy very cogently shared with us. We fully acknowledge and also celebrate the fact that rape and sexual crimes started to get noticed by international and national policymakers only as a result of very fierce feminist struggles. These commendable efforts were meant to serve as entry points to include gendered violence in policy agendas. But the problem we have now is that the entry points have become the only points. There's a fixation on sexual violence against women in war and conflict by the international and national policy bodies. And this has led to sort of a hierarchy of gravities to some crimes, while the others are completely overlooked and considered even as alternative narratives, right? It's something like the Olympics of gendered violence. So we want to push this intellectual and advocacy agenda beyond this privileging of certain forms of violence over others. So we try to address this by bringing in perspectives from political economy and the work of feminist political economists in particular, to broaden the understanding of gendered violence during conflict and war and in the aftermath of it. The first step of doing this is to think differently about war and conflict. We try to, in this book, step away from thinking about war as an exceptional situation between two groups or more, and that causes gender conflict. We do not assume that violence is confined to physical spaces of combat either. We do not assume that war begins on a particular date and ends on a particular date. So there's no black and white understanding of the time and space of war. We also do not put people into mutually exclusive boxes of victim and perpetrator, because these are often based on ahistorical assumptions and sometimes colonial readings that typically fail to account for the continuity of structural violence, where these categories are not so clear-cut. Instead, we think of war as moments of eruption in an ongoing course of class, ideological, and political formation in the context of capitalist expansion or accumulation. We don't really entertain very rosy ideas about democracy either, because the experiences of democracy and capitalist expansion together, which have also complemented each other, as history shows, this partnership between democracy and capitalist expansion has demonstrated that these processes can foster and reproduce violent conditions. So what we foreground in our framing are political, economic relations. We draw from critical and feminist political economist analysis on war and conflict. We do not label women simply as victims of war. We think of them as participants and actors negotiating within a context of militarized political economic system with supra-local, if not global dimensions. We look at how war economies and women's roles and work are intertwined. We do so by factoring in historical and the contemporary, local and the global, political and economic relations. Together, these form, produce, and reproduce violence, and also how they reshape gender identities. By trying to situate conflict and violence within political economy, we see a broad canvas where we can map violence. We begin to understand how multiple crises generated by economic globalization and development and macroeconomic policies, trade liberalization, and economic deregulation, together with financial crises, climate crises, and militarization, pose new challenges, particularly to women. These realities of the global political economic order are often absent, or we tend to overlook them, where we analyze violence against women. We cannot talk about women's security without talking about the material basis of relationships that govern the distribution of resources, entitlements, and authority within the home or the community, and also the international realm. Our approach also helps us not to reduce gendered violence to a consequence of men's aggression in a private or public sphere, right? In other words, I think our framing of violence is to see the continuities and the ruptures of the gendered dimensions linked to patriarchy and the impacts of differential political economic arrangements beyond the temporalities of war. That sort of sums up the framing, but all of you are welcome to read the chapter, which has a much broader discussion about the framing.
Thank you, Anita. I'm not sure if I'm on. I can't see my screen with the icons or the platform.
You're
so
not?
I'm not sure if I'm on.
Okay, you're not.
I'm not.
No.
So I will come to you.
Okay. Shall I start?
You silent. Yes, you can start. So I'm just inviting Vagisha to use the framing to
Vagisha, we cannot hear you. Still cannot hear you.
Can you, is it?
It's working
Yes,
now.
okay.
Now it's
Okay.
fine.
Is it fine?
Yes, now it works. Now it's working.
Okay. All right. Sorry. It says, I'll start again. All right. Okay, I hope everybody can see the screen and also hear me. This screen provides a little bit of context for the Sri Lanka chapter that Vijay Nagaraj and I co-authored. So in the case study of Sri Lanka, we saw an interesting trend. Most people think that war hinders growth, right? But in our case, in Sri Lanka's case, the economy grew amid the war. And Sri Lanka opens up the economy, what we call liberalization, in 1977, and the war officially starts in 1983. So these two processes, liberalization and the war, they run parallelly to each other, and they feed off of each other as well. So we look at the conflict in this way. The unfolding of economic reforms with the advent of the neoliberal framework that integrates economic liberalization, globalization, trade, democratization, and governance, that was spearheaded, of course, by the World Bank and the IMF, created various social dislocations like unemployment and exacerbated uneven regional development, which has been happening for decades in the country. So the war, in many ways, cushioned some of the negative effects of the reforms, partly because the security sector absorbed labor due to the rapid expansion of employment opportunities in the military and related industries. In Sri Lanka, we see that even from the map, the geographies of combat were physically separated from the geographies of production. And we think it is because these two processes of liberalization and conflict went parallelly to each other. Spatially, as you can see, it led to a geographical separation of the primary theater of war in the north and east, and the primary theaters of production located in the west, Central Hills, and the south. So in other words, Sri Lanka's entry to global economic structures or unhindered entry to it and the global capital circuits, right? And the outbreak of war massively reorganized production, labor, and land in this country. We looked at both processes and tried to map out gendered violence inherent in domestic and global political economic structures. Various feminist scholars have argued that women, nature, and people of impoverished countries are locations of extraction and dispossession in global economic structures, and that they're the base of capitalist accumulation. Their subordination and exploitation have historically and continue to be essential premises for capitalist expansion. So the focus is on understanding historical and contemporary interactions between sexual, social, and international divisions of labor. And as an example, we talk about the free trade zones, which were established in 1977 as part of economic liberalization. So 70% of the workforce in FTZs are women. FTZs became central to securing Sri Lanka's place in the global apparel value chain, but on the back of becoming a privileged enclave of capital, exempt from normal tax and labor regimes, much like the maquiladoras in Mexico. During the early years of the war, there was heavy recruitment, and there was a notable ideological trope. We called it Gahanu Juki Pirimi Tuaku, which means Juki sewing machines for women and guns for men. It was a discursive strategy called to serve the nation.
I'm off sound.
I'll take so the idea was to employ poor rural women's nimble fingers to drive Sri Lanka within the global circuits of production. Basically the production chain of garments in order to keep financing a war. Young women from rural and peri-urban areas flocked to the free trade zones in search of economic security for their families in an atmosphere of generalized precariousness and war. Another dynamic was the large-scale migration of women workers as domestic laborers to the oil-rich Middle East. We talk about both of these effects of economic liberalization and of war. They're both enclaves of production. And the social contract in these enclaves is underpinned by coercion and violence. Migrant women workers' remittances account for the lion's share of foreign exchange earnings for the country even today. The apparel sector of Sri Lanka is the second largest contributor to the national GDP. So in this chapter, we outline several enclaves of production like the FTZs or migrant workers, or the financialization and the self-employed woman that were central to the political economy of war. Now, the question that we try to ask is, are these women victims only? So in the chapter, we discuss women working in these enclaves as participants and actors trying to negotiate within a context of militarized political economic system with supralocal, if not global, dimensions. With that, I'll end and turn it over to Kumi. Thank you.
Is that okay? No? So, okay, I seem to be having a problem. I'm so sorry. We seem to be having a problem. So, and now there's an I guess that's Is this all right now? Yeah, I'm so sorry about this glitch. I thank Bagisha for her presentation, which I hope you think is a very interesting take on the framing. And I move on to invite Dr. Cecilia Lopez Montano, who I'll introduce first. She co-authored the chapter on Colombia with Maria Claudia Holstein. And Cecilia has been in public service in Colombia for over 20 years. She is a former senator and a well-known economist from the Los Andes University. She has 2 postgraduate degrees in demography and the economy of education. She has headed key ministerial and policy departments in the Colombian government. A more detailed bio of Dr. Lopez is in the chat box. I'd like a question to you, Cecilia, that in framing gendered violence in the way we have in this book, how does it help complicate certain assumptions we make, particularly in relation to the victimizing of women? In this case, the case of Colombia illuminates this point very well. What makes Colombian rural women, for instance, who are affected so severely by the conflict, move beyond victimhood to exercise such tremendous agency? So over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cami. If I understood well, because the connection is not very well, you were asking me why we consider that women were more than victims and became actors. Was that the question that you were framing?
Yes, with particular, yes, Cecilia, with particular reference to rural women, as your chapter highlighted.
Can I highlight the main issues of my book? That's what of my chapter, or I concentrate on the question?
It's up to you. You have 5 minutes, so you can pick out key points and speak to those.
Okay, so I want to highlight some of the key issues. It was a very long conflict, basically a rural conflict with a lot of perpetrators. We have paramilitary, we have guerrilla, the FARC, and we have also military forces. One of the characteristics of this conflict was that different from many other internal conflicts, the economy grew during these 50 years, and there were social changes in the society of Colombia that was quite unusual, because normally a conflict will stop economic growth. Well, that didn't happen in Colombia, although at the end, we still have a very unequal society. But the main issue we want to highlight is that women were chosen as a weapon to control and submit men and communities. And we identify what happened in Colombia as a clear case of women as a weapon of war. Why do we consider that they move from victims to actors? If it was through the political economy analysis that allow us to understand what happened beyond the fact that women suffered a lot of atrocities during the conflict. We went back to the family context, to the culture of the rural areas, and then we'd find that women play different roles in the conflict. In the first place, they were combatants. Many of them joined the guerrilla, the FARC. And in the analysis, many people think that they were just kidnapped and submitted to the guerrilla troops. Well, that was not completely true. There were women who chose to do that, to join the guerrilla, because they found that they will have more freedom to decide their lives, because they have a very cruel context within their families in the rural areas. So they were part of these troops. They were combatants, and they felt they could decide if they could have some sort of a career. But there were the other group of women, the civilian rural women, that they live in a context of very strong patriarchal norms, and they had endured historically sexual abuse within the families, and a lot of abuses that many people thought that they will, when the conflict came, they will be very vulnerable. But what surprises us is that they went weak. They took a very strong decisions. They promoted changes in laws. They called the justice in Colombia so that people will know what was happening in the middle of this conflict. Okay, so women then were used by the paramilitaries. That is another question that I will answer afterwards, because the paramilitaries understood that women were a weapon to weaken the men, and the way of doing it is with showing that men could not protect women from sexual abuse. That was why these public rapes of women weaken men's ability to defend their land, and this was something very a cause of one of the explanations of displacement. Civilian rural women were not diminished by the atrocities, but they forced laws. They were very active protecting their lands and families. They were combatants, and this million of women, more than 3 million women, uh, were, when they came to the cities, they brought the word to the cities, and they allowed the people to understand what was happening in the rural sector. So finally, they became urban workers. They were stronger than men. Men weren't able to be working in the cities, but women did. So they were the ones who brought income to the families. Of course, that caused a lot of problems within their family because men were not doing anything. They couldn't work in the urban area. So again, women became actors, even in the process of displacement. And I think there are at least three paradigms that were broken by these women within the context of the conflict in Colombia. The idea that sexual violence destroys women was not true for the campesinas, the rural women in Colombia. The situation was that this conflict, this sexual violence, empowered them, gave them courage and strengthened them to fight for the families. The other paradigm that was broken by them was that the conflict does not affect gender roles. In the case of Colombia's conflict, yes, it did. It changes the gender roles. Men were destroyed by their inability to protect the women. The big loss in the war was the loss of masculinity. Public policies are neutral to gender-based violence against women. That's another paradigm. Well, that was not the case in Colombia. Governmental decisions affected the situation of women, and in a very concrete way. What happened with the opening of the economy was that the poor peasants lost a lot because they could not compete with the international prices. But the message to the big landowners was basically the message was you have to move to agribusiness. And that meant that they needed more land. Who were the partners to get more land for the big landowners? The paramilitaries. What did they do? They understood that the only way to push men out of the land, because they were the owners of the land, not women, was to destroy what they should have done to protect their women. That was the role that was supposed men to have at this moment. But paramilitaries understood that this violation of the sexual violence of women publicly shown was going to weaken this role. And this was the cause that helped the paramilitaries to get the land and to get men out of their plots. And they have to migrate with the whole family, women, men, and children. But women were the ones that once in the city were able, as I said before, to generate the income for the family. So all these analysis that would have been possible if we haven't thought about the political and the cultural, the historical, and the economic context in which the conflict developed. Would have been impossible to understand why women were not just victims, as everybody sees them, but they changed laws. They got the opinion of the justice sector. 20 years later, after this 50-year conflict, they were able to put everybody to look what happened and to force some policies to help not only women, but the rights of the rest of the members of the family. I think this will
Can
give
you
a
wrap
general
up?
idea. Yeah,
Thank you, Cecilia. Can you wrap up now?
Pami?
Can you wrap up now, please?
Yes. So in general terms, I want to finish saying that the Colombian conflict is different from many other internal conflicts. And that has to be recognized in order to move to something that is very difficult at this point in Colombia, that is the post-conflict, where it's still in conflict, even though we have a peace agreement. But women have not played in the post-conflict moment the role they should have played since they were so important as actors of the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. We now have someone who's not a chapter writer. She's Dr. Khulud Al-Jarma. Khulud was a young feminist with Dawn, and she was part of a series of case studies that we then got written using this framework. So it's an interesting experiment that we did. And I think Khulud would say, I hope that it was useful in her work. Dr. Khulud Al-Ajma is a researcher and lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. She has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Groningen, and she has worked for many years in fields of migration, refugee rights, visual culture, gender and environmental rights in Palestine, in the Mediterranean region, and in Europe. She's also an award-winning photographer and filmmaker. We thought to ask Khulud a question about her work on the case study, but Khulud, you can also speak to any points you wish to highlight. I think I'll leave you to make a call on that and speak to what you want to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. And first, I would like to thank Doan for inviting me to be part of this publication and also to be part of today's event. I was actually part of Doan Training Institute in 2016, and it was a privilege meeting a group of young activist feminists from the global South and working together since. And when I was asked to write a chapter, a case study for this publication, I thought a lot about different aspects of gender-based violence against Palestinian women and the situation that we live in. And as a Palestinian myself, I saw different aspects that I could cover. But in the case of Palestine and in studying gender-based violence in general, I thought it's an opportunity to look at this framing and to take into consideration the complex economic, social, political, and cultural dynamics that affect the lives of the community members in conflict. And here we're not talking about like pre-conflict or post-conflict. We're talking about conflict that has been going on for over 70 years. So there is like the Israeli economy that has developed over these years, and the Palestinian economy that also over these years have been marginalized because of the domination of the occupying state. So when I looked at the lives of the women that I worked with in different contexts, I saw how women are affected by the Israeli occupation and the resulting humanitarian crisis, and which is also very deeply gendered, and also it builds on existing cultural norms and gender inequalities that these women face. And women in general have to endure this violence first by the occupation that is brought to all Palestinians, but also there are gender-specific consequences that women have to deal with that the other members of the community normally have less consequences in that sense. So in my case study, I looked at just one segment of Palestinian women, groups of Palestinian women who are rural women working in Israeli settlements. And for those not familiar with the situation, Israeli settlements are settlements like households that are constructed on Palestinian lands. They are illegal under international law, but for the Israeli economy, they are very important since many of these settlements are built on Palestinian fertile lands. So many of them are agricultural settlements, and many of their produce is exported internationally, and it is important for the Israeli economy, as I said. So drawing on interviews and observations of Palestinian women workers in Israeli settlements, I looked at different aspects or different layers of gender-based violence that these women face. It starts with the circumstances of economic hardship and lack of alternative livelihoods that because of high unemployment and declining quality of life, which leaves Palestinian women with no option but to work in these Israeli-controlled settlements in order to financially support their families and in order to fight poverty as well. So the violence against women exists in all this hierarchy. It exists in the economic relations that these women have. It's often unstructured kind of work that they have to do. Their low wages, hard working conditions, they often have to leave the house before sunrise, come back very late in the evening. And the system itself is facilitated by brokers who are Palestinians who find for the Israeli settlers Palestinian women to work for them. So these brokers as well add to the problem by financially exploiting the women. The women themselves in their work conditions are subjected often to sexual or verbal harassment. Often they don't talk about it because that would mean losing their job, and often they have no rights at all. So if they lose their job, they don't have right to compensation, they don't have right to health insurance, they don't have any rights within the work system as well. Culturally, these women are often also stigmatized because working for Israeli settlement is seen as something like against national principles, and also something often seen as like a socially accepted, let's say, type of work. However, these women often have no other alternatives. So it's either living in hunger and poverty or having to work in these inhuman conditions. So all these factors combined make us look at the whole picture where women are, I don't want to call them victims, but in a way they are subject to different forms of violence that are very hard to resist. So the women are resisting poverty, for example, by finding alternative economic ways of living, but at the same time they are facing different kinds of violence that are very difficult to deal with. So it is important when we look at such a case where we look at women who are part of an economic system, as the economic system of the Israeli settlements, for example, to look at not only that these are women now, let's say, empowered by having an actual income economically or financially, but at the same time there are levels of violence that they live through, including cultural issues, political issues, and economic issues that we have to look at when we study or look at cases of women who are living in conflict in relation to gender-based violence. And I'll stop here.
Sorry, Kulud, you were muted. Maybe you could, if you could wrap up in 1 minute, please. Maybe we can go on.
Was I muted through the whole thing?
No. Just
No,
this
no.
last minute. At least I think it was just this last minute. Not minute even.
Okay,
sure.
so what I wanted to wrap up with is that when we study gender-based violence in general within a conflict setting, it is important to look at it from its complexity, from the economic, social, political, and cultural dynamics, because it's not only the economic aspect. Many people, for example, donor communities, when they come and want to work with people post-conflict, they look at, let's do economic empowerment for these women, for example. But this is not the only thing we need to look at. So these women that I worked with, they do have a financial income in a way, but the system itself, the economic system, the social, political, and cultural system still contributes to gender-based violence against them. So it's important to look at all these aspects when we look at how women in conflict deal with different hierarchies of political or social dynamics. And I'll stop here. I hope that's fine.
Thank you, Kulod. Yes, that's fine. I hope we can come back to you with other questions. And I will just move on to give all the speakers a first round of intervention. My next speaker that I will call upon now is Roshmi Goswami. And she is a very close friend and colleague who is based in the northeast of India. Roshmi is a feminist human rights activist who began her work on conflict over 2 decades ago, surfacing the realities of conflict in the northeastern states of India, often invisible. And she has years of experience working on women's human rights, both as an activist and as a grant maker. She is known for her work on the impact of armed conflict on different categories of women and works with several regional networks in both South Asia and the Asia Pacific. Roshmi, I would say I'm not going to ask you a question or ask you to concentrate on something I want to ask you, but I would ask you to present something from your chapter that you wish to highlight. Thank you. Over to you, Roshmi.
Okay. Hello, everybody. First and foremost, let me thank Kumi and the Dawn team for this opportunity. It has indeed been a very, very rich experience being part of this project and this analysis. Thank you. It has been a great pleasure. As Kumi indicated, my work is based in northeast of India. Damien, can you put up so that people have a...
Vagisha is good, Roshmi. We seem to be having glitches with this a little bit. Vagisha is good. Will you carry on speaking and we'll put the map.
Okay, so my paper is located in the northeast of India, which consists of 7 states, which is really outside the mainland of India. And it's a region which is connected to the rest by a very small corridor, which is 22. And this is for people who don't know where it is located, 22 kilometers. So it's a very small portion that connects you to India, and the rest of the region has actually international borders of Bangladesh, of Bhutan, of Tibet, of Myanmar. This region is infamous for conflict, which has gone into several years, low intensity, protracted conflict, which has gone into decades. At the moment, we are what is termed as protracted peace process. So there is no violent direct conflict, but the conflict has kind of gone into some kind of a protracted phase. What has been distinctive? I look at my paper, looks at how political, social, economic, and ideological processes have shaped and impacted violence against women in the region. And one of the aspects that I bring up in my analysis, and that's why it's called entrenched peripherality, is the kind of violence that is experienced or that was experienced in the region was also determined by how the region or the communities were perceived. They were the peripheral other. peripheral other, not just in terms of geography, but peripheral other also in terms of their ethnicity, ethnic identities, their religion, their food habits, custom, culture, ethos, you name it. So there was an element of othering. So in my case studies, I talk about the the brutality of the violence, and I talk about the redoubled misogyny against the women because of this notion of the other. And for me, as I speak about it today, it has special significance given the kind of othering and given the kind of divisiveness that seems to have become the kind of, almost the hallmark of what is going on in the rest of the country. So an analysis of what is it that goes into making this kind of violence even different from any other kind of violence when it is the other is one question that I raise. But more coming to the present context, what it is presently, as I said, in a state of protracted peace. So the question that one asks the women is, what is it? How do you imagine peace? What is it that you seek at this moment of peace building and peace negotiations? So one thing was very clear, that while women asked for redress for direct violence, of sexual violence, there was a consistent demand for addressing deeper, more structural instances of violence. And this across all of the three, I forgot to mention that I looked at actually three locations in this region. I looked at the Naga armed resistance and the conflict related to that. I looked at the Mizo one, which is at the bottom of the map, and I looked at instances from Assam itself, which is the yellow part of the map. So while I didn't have a scholarly analysis of the political economy argument, but the case studies that one got, or the women that one kind of interacted with or studied for this paper, all of them supported the political economy argument that violence is a continuum which is enabled by the hierarchical social arrangements in both the private and the public. And the hierarchical arrangements in some of these communities are also determined by what is known as their customary laws, which are extremely gender discriminatory. So the violence continues from the outside as well as inside because of the customary structures, which have both structured the way women are positioned in society, as well as have structured their agency in the community. So so women have not just asked for change, asked for redress for sexual violence, but have asked for or fought for alongside peace building. They have fought for changing of customary laws and practices. And these customary laws and practices consist of inheritance rights, of land rights, of custody rights, of most importantly, political participation, which is denied to many of these communities. So these, alongside the peace process, women have also been demanding these rights, and in some of the instances, they have actually succeeded in changing some of the very, very regressive customary practices. The other aspect uh, which has created this culture of impunity apart from the customary laws is what the government itself, what the state brought in. Because this was a region which, apart from being peripheral and the other, was also the very first region which questioned the nation state. India had just got its independence in 1947, and immediately after the Naga resistance started, and the Naga resistance started with questioning. So that again raises, how do you deal with a small community that questions authority? And it kind of, in my case studies, it comes out in different ways where this is the authoritarianism which was imposed on these communities is highlighted. But one aspect, one thing, one very, very draconian structure which was imposed was the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which was a special measure law which was brought in as a temporary special measure in 1958, but it has been in operation till date. And this is what has provided huge militarization in the region, and the militarization, even though it is now in a state of peace processes, peace deals are being struck every now and then. There is jubilance about what peace deals have been negotiated, but the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which has enabled total impunity for violations by the military, continues. So this essentially is the structure in which these studies have been done. What is interesting now is in this peace process, or in this period of protracted peace, and my study doesn't go into great details on that, but what is very, very disturbing is the ideological and the economic aspects which is being brought in terms of development, the development mantra which has come in. And it is yet to be seen where the region goes with that kind of structuring that is very, very stealthily, very, very strategically being brought in the name of peace process, in the name of development. And it's perhaps a study which needs to be done with a very sharp political economy lens. I think I will stop here for now. Oh, finally, I just want to say that my paper ends then, that for enduring peace, for peace which really means something for women, what are we actually, and this comes from the case studies, and this comes from the interviews of the women, is what is it that we can really push for. And I argue for a transformative justice approach. And the transformative justice approach is not something which is being kind of promoted now, but it's something I think the feminist movement has been talking about and pushing for a long while. And that is the approach that I argue for, that the whatever women have, their notion or their imagination of peace actually fits into this transformative justice framework that that is being analyzed by academics and other peace activists and scholars. So
Thank you.
end.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting place to leave us with. And I hope we can get back to this discussion in the next round of interventions. I would now call on Yali Clark, who is the final presenter for this round, and our next panelist, of course. And she's from South Africa. She is the interim director of the African Gender Institute and a lecturer in gender studies at the School of African and Gender Studies, Anthropology and Linguistics at the University of Cape Town. She has interacted with a wide range of women's rights activists, peace builders, and conflict resolution practitioners in over 11 countries in Africa. She is currently a PhD candidate in social development at the University of Cape Town. Yalibe's chapter actually looks at northern Uganda, and in particular discusses the context in which women's peace groups emerged. I'd ask Yalibe to speak a bit of this experience and her analysis in relation to this, as it was presented in the book. Thank you. Over to you, Yalibe. And please put your camera on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, Yalibe, I can, yes.
Yes. Okay. And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yes, so my chapter is titled Reimagining Subversion, Agency and Women's Peace Activism in Northern Uganda. And I co-authored this with Dr. Constance O'Brien, who is also my PhD supervisor. So the interesting thing about this chapter and this context is really something that this book enabled me to theorize in a way that I think offers a very critical African feminist analysis to the women, peace and security agenda as has been shared earlier. And what the chapter does is that it offers an analysis of women peace activists who set up peace groups at the height of the war in northern Uganda in the late 1990s through to the early 2000s. This war, and these are the districts, Kitgum, Gulu, and Lira, in which I conducted my research. So the chapter is based on extracts from my PhD research. So what happened in the war in northern Uganda, it's very important to understand the political, economic history of the war in northern Uganda that dates back to British colonial political and administrative rule and governance in Uganda. Most of us will be familiar with the southern part of Uganda, which is very much near Lake Victoria, and the capital city is Kampala. What British colonial rule did was to partner with communities in what we now understand to be southern parts of Uganda, and formed a political partnership that was used to dominate through indirect rule other communities in the rest of Uganda. And what that meant from the 1900s, I think it was 1901, when the partnership was formed with the Baganda Kingdom in the south, near Kampala, was that other ethnic communities in the rest of the countries got, I would use the word dominated or ruled over by the Baganda in collaboration with the British colonial administration and political structures. And so what that caused historically was an economic marginalization of communities that were on the peripheries of the Baganda kind of what the British understood to be a kind of monarchical governance structure. And so the history of the war in northern Uganda is very much rooted in that tension between communities in what we understand to be the south and the rest of Uganda. For northern Uganda, they were both politically and economically marginalized from this kind of governance system that peripherized northern Uganda based on ethnicity, which was a gendered also perception and militarized perception of communities in Uganda as predominantly being military, good for military rule, good for basic labor, and unskilled. And particularly men were seen to be actually, not good for skilled governance. And so there was especially strong marginalizations of community in northern Uganda. So with that history of the war come the takeover by Museveni in the late 1980s. I'm not going to go into detail of that history, but what there was a moving of a lot of Ugandan men from the northern communities who had been militarized by being recruited way back from the British colonial rule into the military structures of the British colonial government, which then became the post-independent, flag independence military and government, which then also grew once there was some leadership from the north. We know very well Idi Amin. He recruited a lot of men from the north when he took over, and before that, Obote. And so when Museveni came into power from a different ethnic community via coup d'etat, via military takeover, these men moved back to their ancestral homes in the north, fully militarized, right? Fully militarized. So this is some of the key points to understand with the history of the war in northern Uganda. And so when they arrived fully militarized, politically organized in militarized ways, forming militia groups to then resist the new government headed by the National Resistance Army, still then known now as the National Resistance Movement headed by Museveni. That is when we had a fuller remilitarization of northern Uganda. And my research asked women who founded peace groups at the height of the war, what was going on in your lives at that time, and why did you form the peace groups that you did in the late 90s and early 2000s? By then, the war had been going on for up to 20 years, moving on to 30 years. And even though we're in a post-war or post-conflict period, the structural, economic, and political systems that created the war and very much militarized are still part of the everyday lives of people there. Interesting answer to my question across the board is, why did you women set up peace groups? An interesting answer was that the men became useless. And what they meant by useless was that because the men were and these are civilian men. So these military soldiers who moved to the north, who then regrouped politically for a hoped another takeover of this government led by Yoweri Museveni from a different ethnic group. These militia groups targeted civilian men and recruited them, forcibly recruited them into these militia groups. Most of you would have heard of the Lord's Resistance Army headed by Joseph Kony, one of the most well-known militia groups, but there were many others. And they recruited them forcibly. They either killed them, recruited, grabbed, looted cattle, and this resulted in mass displacement. And what happened, what that meant is what the backbone of what it meant to be a provider or masculine authority within the clan system and the local socioeconomic networks within the community were actually destroyed or destabilized. Let's use that word, heavily destabilized. So what happened was men were not able to cope with this situation of extreme precarity and displacement and destruction. So the women said they founded the peace groups, if only to deal with the uselessness of these men, whether they are fathers, uncles, sons, who were unable to cope. And some of the statistics, evidence of this is in the displacement camps in these three districts, in those particular towns, Kitgum, Gulu, and Lira, where most people moved to during the height of the war to seek refuge. And some of them were forcibly moved into these towns by the government who were attacking civilians because they thought civilians were supporting these militia groups. With this mass displacement and forced movement of civilian populations into Gulu, Kitgum, and Lira, what happened was that there was an inability of the government to actually provide for socioeconomically for the communities that were displaced. In those displacement camps, there were very high rates of suicide, and the suicide rates for men were much higher than that of women. And that's one of the indications, and there needs to be more research on this. So I'll just end there, but it's very interesting that when I asked women why they founded these peace groups, why they focused on women, and their main answer was because men became useless. I'll just end there. I think I may be running out of time. Kumi, could you guide me?
Yes, Yaliwe. I was thinking I'll give you a few minutes, but I think we are up for time at this point. Okay. We can go into the question and answer session. There are some questions in the chat box, particularly to Cecilia and to Roshmi. And I'll come back with maybe another round of questions if we have time, or you can come back with a point you might want to highlight. So thank you very much. And we did have two questions. Let me see if I can find them. One to Roshmi and one to Cecilia. And so Roshmi, the question to you was, how does religious extremism compound the effects of violence against women? And this is asked by Ruth Mathan. Would you want to respond first, please?
Yeah, well, first I already answered that in the sense that, but then I want to put that answer in another context. The Colombian conflict has two elements that are key. One of them is that the economic decisions of the government in the middle of a conflict, in the case of Colombia, affected very negatively women. Globalization changed the scenario. And that was the worst part of the conflict. After 50 years in 1990, they opened the economy. And what happened? In that case, what happened was that there was a link between paramilitarism, displacement, and women. So it's very important to have an economic view of what influence those things have on women. What happened then? Then, as I said before, it was agribusiness what was important. So the landowners, the big landowners, joined themselves or found a partnership with the paramilitary in order to have more land. They needed more land. So how could they get the land? The land was owned by men. Women did not have the right to have any land in the rural areas. So how would the paramilitary push these men and their families out of the land to give it to the landlord? Well, what the paramilitaries used was sexual abuse. But when it was done publicly, it diminished the role of men that were supposed to protect women. So in that case, women became a weapon of war, a very effective, because when this happened, when this
to see where it gets to, no?
Pami, are you listening? Is it clear? Then the big issue is that economic policies do influence the situation of women. And in Colombian case, there was this scenario for displacement, and displacement was done through using women as a weapon of war. But the other thing that I would like to highlight here that is related to this answer is that if you want to understand what happened to women in Colombia, you have to understand what happened to men. I mean, you have to get out of the box of the traditional analysis that we made usually of women. We have to understand the whole context. So I would like to bring here a sentence that we wrote with Maria Claudia in our chapter. It says, the strength and voice of campesinas, the rural women in Colombia, already achieved, this is one point that is very important, already achieved what urban women still hope for. I mean, they were so strong in getting positive things, but the message to the world is that we need to look beyond the obvious when it comes to study what happened to women, different to the traditional view, and to understand what happened to men. I know this is a very unusual way of analyzing what's going on with women within the conflict. But in the case of Colombia, if we haven't studied what happened to men, how they were weakened by this public sexual violence of their women that they were supposed to protect, we wouldn't have been able to understand what happened to women and why they reacted, promoting laws and telling everybody what was going on with the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. That was a very extensive answer. I have a few questions, and I'll go with the first question to Roshmi. And that question says, can you hear me, Roshmi?
Yes, Kumi.
There is a question to you. If you read it, you can answer it. But it says, how does religious extremism compound the effects of violence against women?
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a huge question for a huge country. And it's it's a very, very, very relevant question for this moment, political moment. I don't think I can do justice totally to the question. In the other regions, I have experience, of course, of Gujarat and others, and how it impacts, no doubt. But I am here presenting uh, a particular region which has had armed conflict for many years, and I will take the question in that region, if you don't mind. Um, uh, in the initial part of the conflict, although it wasn't. Yep. Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, you may continue now.
Yes, yes. Yeah, in the conflicts of Northeast India, religion as such did not play a very, very visible role right at the start, but there were certainly instances of violence which was perpetrated against women because they were, as I said, they were already the peripheral other, both geographically, in terms of religion, in terms of ethnicity. Ethnicity was a very, very important deciding factor. And religion came in there as well, but religion wasn't the primary one. But to kind of drive home a fact that you are the other and we are different and we are whatever, there has been, and I have documented instances of brutal violence within the boundaries of a religious place of worship. So there was. And subsequently in the region, the uh, religion playing a role is gradually becoming more and more pronounced. When I ended and said that there is a need at this moment to look at the ideological and the economic factors which are kind of uh, which are supporting, which are enabling, which are perpetrating structural violence. And I think in a study like that, a more of how strategically and how surreptitiously religion is playing a role in that region would come out. But as of now, in my study, I didn't have a very focused emphasis on religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshmi. Yes, that was a pretty difficult question to answer. I have another question that I will now pose to Kulud. Where is it? And so the question that came to you, Kulud, was what are the steps being taken in Palestine to deal with the situation of the women employed by Israelis and abused in different ways? I believe you touched on this a little bit, but if you want to elaborate further.
Thank you. Well, it's a bit difficult to put it into like different steps that are being taken, because discrimination in general in workplace, even in Palestinian areas, is still common. So so in terms of the women who work in the Israeli sector or in Israeli settlements, it is often seen as a part of informal economy. So there are even no specific numbers of like how many women do the work, and especially in agricultural settlements, how many women do that work and have permits, so they're legal to work there under Israeli regulations, and how many women do it informally, so they do it without having a permit, but they still get access to their workplace. So different categories, let's say, of these women, depending on their work conditions, have different are dealt with differently, but often they all have minimum rights, if any. So within the Palestinian Authority, there's not much that is being done about it. Many local NGOs, like women organizations, try to do psychosocial support for these women. Some try to do alternative economic solutions. So there is one organization that I know of, for example, that started a small business initiative trying to attract women who work in the settlements to leave their work there and start small businesses of their own. So that is one of the initiatives that I know of. But legally, or in terms of like a more systematic framework, nothing has been done to solve this problem. And it is an ongoing problem within the actual structure of a very weak Palestinian economy. So for many of these women, there is no alternative. So it is mainly these NGOs or women organizations that try to help the women as much as they can, depending, of course, on their agendas on funding and so on. So, but in general, very little is being done.
Thank you, Kulud. I have one more question here in the chat box, and that's directed at Yaliwe. And you asked Yaliwe to please elaborate more on the notion of male uselessness within courts and how this impacted on gender relations in northern Uganda.
Thank you for that question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to actually give some more detail on what uselessness, just what happened during the war that then got the women to describe the situation of men as useless. So I'll just read from the chapter that Constance and I wrote. So we pointed out that the National Resistance Army of Yoweri Museveni and the Lord's Resistance Army, as well as the then Ugandan army, were all known to steal cattle, loot property, rape and abduct or kill or maim people. Now, the mass loss of cattle and abduction, mostly of boys and young men, further resulted in a kind of destabilization of masculine authority. So what version of masculine authority was destabilized? The authority that men had within the community by virtue of owning land as clan elders, as husbands, as uncles. So the patrilineal clan system was then very much destabilized, which was a source of and a very important node of masculine authority within the community. Linked to that was also cattle, right? So ownership of cattle and land, very much central to masculine authority. So with this version of militarization, with the forced recruitment of mainly men and boys, killing of mainly men and boys, women and girls were killed too. However, the consequences of that murder and killing and maiming on masculine authority was very stark. So the women's main issues was that the men were not able to cope with life economically and also their family role without these markers of masculine authority and power. So without the cattle, without the land, without also the nodes, the clarified nodes within the clan system. Remember, there was overcrowding within these displacement camps. So there's a mixing of clans, mixing of ethnic communities in the north. And this meant that the clarity of their network of authority within the patrilineal clan system was extremely destabilized. And so then the situation was that there were 4 times less number of men than women in the camps. So less men, more women, and the men resorted to drinking and they were extremely depressed. So suicide rates were much higher for men. So just another quote from the book, especially from the perspective of older men. So older men felt that they had been made redundant, while younger men attempted to recover their status by abandoning school, opting for early marriage, and struggling to provide for their families. Remember also, like in the case of, I think it's Colombia, witnessing sexual violence against women also weakened masculine authority over security and protection. So to witness women being raped or to witness women coping through sexual trade or of their bodies within the displacement camps further, undermine or destabilize their sense of well-being from the position of masculine authority. So these men felt trapped in an identity vacuum in which they were neither men nor children, a dilemma they tried to solve through risky social behavior, which was drinking, dropping out of school, early marriage, trying to insert the authority over some, forcibly created family within the displacement camps in order to have some kind of control over that they're used to within the clan system. And so the women coped with this, as in other case studies in this book, was to actually, initially they scavenged, right? So they looked for food in old gardens, derelict gardens and farms around. They relied heavily on humanitarian handouts. And actually the few humanitarian organizations that were there, because they arrived much later, because politically the Ugandan government did not want to say there was a humanitarian disaster in North Uganda for a very long time. So the few who were there realized very quickly that if they gave the handouts and development opportunities to men in the displacement camps and the surrounding communities, it actually was not benefiting the broader community. They would drink it, they would not give it out. So then it was women who took over that role. That's another way in which they coped. Then formed the peace groups, because this humanitarian aid was insufficient, ill-coordinated, and really precarious in its delivery. And so women cope by forming now income generation projects, very small, and then setting up these peace groups, many of which are still in place.
Thank you, Yalive. We've been getting really interesting comments. I think there is this opens up a really good opportunity to discuss this framing further. And I hope Dawn can continue to do this and that you will continue to do this in your work as well, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. But I would like very much to have Radhika come in with a few closing comments, if you will, Radhika.
Radhika no soy yo.
I'm speaking to Radhika. If Radhika is still here, I would like Radhika to come in with some closing comments.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. I just
Thank you,
get
Radhika.
my video on and I'll be there. All right. Okay, thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion. And I'm not going to take too much time, but to me, of course, someone who's worked on this at the global level, I keep, to me, what is it that this conversation adds to or challenges us about global discourses, narratives, and it just shows you the absolute richness and diversity of the local, and need so much to be very, very focused in doing those case studies, doing those understandings from around the world. There are common patterns, but really, you really don't understand women violence and conflict unless you really do the anthropological and sociological work at the level of the community, even of the family. And I think that's one takeaway I have from this, the intersectionality and diversity that is absolutely key to any understanding, any future understanding of women, peace, and conflict. Secondly, that we move away from only sexual violence as the main framework by which we understand violence, and look at other acts of violence, not only acts, but structures of violence and equality that stop women. I mean, I think that is very clear in the book, the continuums, and I think that's also something the latest Security Council resolution is also going in that direction. Now, there are some areas where I heard, but I was Vagisha, about democracy. What do we mean? And it's in this context, especially when we're also talking about militarization, and to learn to have that dialogue. Do we need a representative democratic system like in the United States and the UK, or are we talking about something very different? I think those conversations also have to be had. If you look at the democratic system that's set up, the post-conflict has a template, which is basically a constitutional order that has basically been written by the UN in terms of all its um, various experiences. It's a constitutional order with a legislature, judiciary, parliamentary democracy, and should we be questioning that and pushing for much more radical understandings of democracy and where women are much more prominent? Then the notion that the male perpetrator and the female victim come out of the same system, and in fact, as the Ugandan case study showed us, that actually what happens to men when they lose masculine authority over land and other assets, and then they use them the risky social behavior. And I must say that as I ended my career on women on children and armed conflict, I'd begun with women. I really did feel that it was time to have a better understanding of young men and their role, both as perpetrators and victims of the system. And I think, therefore, this attempt to bring that conversation is also a very good thing. Then there was a discussion of whether this is all on a dialectic or it's on a continuum, and then suddenly there's rupture, and that the war, therefore, is really a rupture in a system that already exists, as opposed to something that occurs because something comes from outside or is formed from something external to it. Well, I don't know whether it's always the case where it comes from a rupture that internally exists. And I would love to have more discussions on that framing of the matter. Roshmi's stuff on transformative justice and militarization is also, I found, very relevant. Transformative justice, especially since I used to go to meet all these women victims of justice in practically every conflict in the world, and in the end, very few actually came into the court of law. But I knew they all fervently wanted justice. But would they have settled for another framing? Is something we never even thought of asking ourselves in the early stages, at least. Maybe perhaps it's doing well now. But basically, I think I don't know if any of you saw the latest Security Council resolution does try to bring in some human security, other issues, but basically it doesn't address power the way we would address it. That whole agenda, mainly because it's coming out of the Security Council, is not suspicious of the state in this whole area. And that I find difficult sometimes to cope with. And I suppose we can't expect anything better from the Security Council. But I think that is something we have to think about, how whether to move, where will these issues that you're all raising, besides in our global sectors and webinars and in these networks, whether there is a more long-term home for these discussions is something we should think about outside perhaps the Security Council. Christine Chicken has suggested a treaty, but that may not be the right time given the way people are thinking. But something where the norms that you have outlined and the dynamics that you mentioned will be recorded, analyzed, and made into something that can be used to define standards and conflicts. I mean, I do believe in the end we do have to have somewhere a framework for defining standards and conflicts once we've understood what actually is going on. And my sense in this area, we really don't understand fully what is going on because of the impetus of the Security Council. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Radhika. Actually, we take your first point very seriously. Dawn has been trying to work with groups of young feminists to get them to do the research that is context-specific, country-specific, locally determined, and to try and use this framing as well to add to the more general and more popular peace and security framing, feminist security studies or international relations framing, to expand that to bring in a political economy framing. But we've also been discussing your very well framed question about what does this mean in the context of, or do we need to have democracies to talk about conflict and conflict transformation? About, do we understand by democracies, particularly in today's context of authoritarian populism and of democracy that is mostly majoritarian democracy and framed as such? And that's something that we will continue to work with, we're looking at. Of the disruption of conflict, whether it's collaboration, a moment in time. I think a lot of the case studies that we're now doing and some of the chapters in the book too are definitely pointing to the fact that war is not an anomaly, that it needs to be seen in the context of existing political economic relations. And that, I think, is another piece of research that we need to engage in. We're particularly keen to everyone who's listening in. Dawn wishes to say to you that we want to discuss this analysis further in dialogue or discussion groups or as a training. And we really invite feminist scholars and activists who might be interested to do this with us, expand this analysis, particularly from the context of ground realities on the one hand, and on the other hand, that the Security Council agenda on peace and security is also so predominant, and particularly now as it gets applied to counterterrorism and radicalization, that we absolutely need to bring this broader framing in. And I don't know how we shift that discussion, simply because it is the discussion in the Security Council. And as you said, Radhika, where is the home for this? And I think in our local context, if we do have a home for it in our local context, we can let the global inform or rather the local inform the global, hopefully, and bring in the policy shifts we want, whether immediately in the Security Council or not, but in the way in which we use the resolutions, in the way in which we use the UN special procedures and so on. But I think this merits further research, certainly, and maybe experimentation at the local level, where all our contexts are so different, and we might be able to bring in solutions. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for staying, actually, everyone. And also, if anybody is interested, please contact us at Dawn to work with us further in developing this analysis, but also and goodbye. I'd just like to see the faces of all the speakers just before we go, so that we can say thank you to each other.
Hi there. My electricity went, so I was in the dark for a bit. I don't know if you can see me.
Yes, we can
Yes,
now.
we can. Thank
Kumi, you're
you.
muted.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Kumi's muted. She's saying something very important.
No, I hope I hope the work. No, I hope the work will continue. That we will use these framings, but that we will also try to challenge our states, and particularly the Security Council, maybe, and maybe we will see shifts incrementally. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Damien, and the rest of the Dawn team.
Thank you, Kumi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, my dear.
The Dawn team.
Roshmi, bye-bye.
Thank you to Radhika for your
Bye.
feedback
See
on
you
the
in
book.
Colombia.
I really
Goodbye,
appreciated it.
Jalil. Okay.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Vagisha.
Bye.
Bye,
Radhika.
Radhika.
Bye.
Bye.
Talk
Bye,
soon.
Radhika. Cecilia, we come to Colombia next.
Yes, next you come to Colombia. Okay, we'll do a launch here. Okay.
Will we get a link to this recording? A lot of people couldn't get in because the CSW was too full.
Yes.
Yeah.
It says that it's recording, so I will download it and upload it to our social media. So once we have the link, I will share it with all of you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
People did.
Bye,
They were,
Radhika. Thank you.
they were texting me saying they're on the waiting list. How do they get in?
Yeah, I had tons of people
wow.
telling me they're on the waiting list from
Yeah.
days ago.
So
That's
that's
true.
because it's part of the whole thing, is it? It's
Yeah,
Yes.
which is unfortunate. Anyways, we can just put it on our social media platforms.
Well,
Yeah,
then I will stop the recording now and
But
Bye.
just
Bye.
before we
Bye.
go,
Ciao.
thank you very much to the Dawn team, actually, to
Thank
Tess,
you.
and
Thank you.
Sharon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.